What's up, everybody? This is Karak with ACG, and welcome to ACG 2.0, reviews that aren't 2 minutes long or filled with a bunch of sponsored bullcrap. But let's be honest, games may change, but the result here won't. It's the same old, same old. I play a game, I'm going to tell you what I thought of it, and someone out there is going to tell me I'm wrong because either Grandpa worked at a delicatessen near the developer, or they can better judge games by video alone than I can by playing. But stuff like that's never going to stop this train from rolling, and rolling is exactly what we're going to do in today's title, Travis Strikes Again, No More Heroes. It only makes sense to me to begin 2019 with a game that looks like it's from 2015 and based on a series from 2010, because Travis Strikes Again, No More Heroes is technically a restart for the character Travis Touchdown. Here, you as Travis find a cursed video game machine and explore different worlds as you play the cartridges you find. It's a unique blend of Gauntlet-style antics, retro moments, and Suda51 craziness. Travis Strikes Again is coming out January 18th for $39.99 by Grasshopper. Let's see how it did, shall we? As always, if you like the video, maybe subscribe. So here's my review for Travis Strikes Again, No More Heroes. Proof retro gaming is bad for you, a ripoff of Resident Evil that makes more sense than Resident Evil does, and resuscitating the dead with coffee and donuts. Graphics are up first. This is a bit hit and miss, I'm going to be honest. First, even the prior games have a rough cel-shaded look to them and a unique art style that never really lent itself to lower resolution titles, and we saw that on the Wii, and Travis Strikes Again sadly has a bit of a problem like that on the Switch, as well as a couple others, with issues in various places including flickering shadows, incredibly rough-looking textures, and an FPS that really does seem to take pretty huge hits when loading into some particular levels. It's hard to really identify what the issue is here because while the game is going for a rougher style at times, it's got such a fantastic retro look at others. Anytime the game is trying to channel Tron so goddamn forcibly you think that Bruce Boxleiter's hiding from his career under your bed, it really nails it, from the dirty, almost black velvet painting art style of the motorbike racing levels to the particular effects for the opening title screens for each of the game worlds you enter. Each one of them, by the way, fantastic work. The game always seems to have a difficult time getting off its feet, however, somewhat like the main character. Jumping animations, and in fact many animations, are really rough with lots of basic clipping and collision issues when going through the more platformy levels. It has a very budget feel to it at times, and even with the oddities of its presentation, the prior games didn't seem to actually have as many issues. That doesn't mean it's all bad. For instance, particular locations may look rough, but they have a style and charm like the Resident Evil ripoff that really does feel like the best handling and best treated game world by a good amount in this title. Level design is also a bit hit and miss, especially when you consider that the games in the title are trying to mimic developers bumping up against the restrictions of the hardware, not trying to take much more powerful hardware and crunch it down. One leads to ingenuity mixed with optimization, the other leads to, well, this. And really, just when you settle down and think, yeah, this is going to end up well, you end up going through an endless tower of boxed rooms that float above a shimmering background and run literally forward for the entire level. We can all pretend that every rough texture and every clipping through the floor and every error we see is all because of some masterful plan, but I think that's a disservice to pretty much everyone involved. It's really trying to bring back the old days of past titles, but take for instance one of the entire worlds where you're chasing down a murderer in the game's main sections. Make the protagonist in the game below look like a friggin' giant. No lie, I'm pretty sure this level's an eye test for eagles who want to fly fighter jets. And that's where Travis does run into some issues. Trying to focus a game's artistic design based on prior titles is a difficult thing to do. Many game devs have spoken about this in interviews, talking about retro titles in particular. But to me, it feels like Travis misses the mark more times than those, especially in a number of places with the roughness and dropping of frames and fights, and especially in that loading. Now, one saving grace easily is the over-the-top main and mini bosses, all alluding to various video game tropes, and some with an incredible atmosphere and spirit, even if it's maybe not matched by the gameplay in those events. Also, there's a number of hidden Easter eggs graphically and just within the gameplay, which I think was really cool. As a package, while Travis has some highlights, even huge fans of the Switch and those who expect far less from slightly lower prices, and huge fans of Suda51 himself, will probably cringe at some of the issues that you're going to run into here. Sound, music, and voice.
Take one more step, and you're dead. It's too late.
And you know what? Let's do voice first in this one. Surprisingly, this also is incredibly lean. I wasn't expecting this. Much of the game's cutscenes occur with nothing but text and a warble mix effect and nonsensical sounds like a goofy platforming game from the 1980s. The few times that the real voice actors are used, it really does elevate the game a great deal, and it's surprising that this wasn't done more, especially with some of the hilarious stories the main characters have in the game. When you pull off special moves, Travis's "fuck you" shout is actually hilarious, and the starting and ending cutscenes are really well done. Sadly, throughout most of the game, though, there really isn't any voice, so take that as you will. And that brings us to sound. Now, everything here has a nice chippy sound to it that fits the game's time periods, from the high-pitched gold coin collection sounds to the overly tinny special move attacks. Sadly, either in mimicking the games of yesteryear or just because they couldn't get the game to do it, it has pretty terrible directional sound, resulting in almost no audio prompts from off-screen like most modern-day games have. Whether you side with this being a purposeful omission or one based on some other decision or restriction, its absence is actually noticeable. For me, I'd say I understand where they were going with it, but I would have liked a little bit more. Music. Now, once again, it's important to remember that this game is trying to mimic old cartridges from the Genesis and SNES days. However, even with that said, almost nothing here has the hooky tunes of excellent songs like those systems did. There's a couple standouts here, especially when the game's diving deeply into replicating 8-bit games or going through a main part of the story, which is on an old Apple IIe game kind of green screen. There's a chunky glory to all of them, harking back to intelligent music design, where it wasn't about resources funding bigger and bigger orchestras, but instead intelligence in deconstructing melodies to fit in smaller and smaller memory spaces. But the best has to be, at least for me, one level where you're going up and down in elevators inside of sort of a decrepit home, and there's this amazing bass hook and a simple synth running throughout that track. I loved it. Now, it can get repetitive, like the room levels where you hunt down a murderer that sound like someone stole an old piano from a Western bar museum so they could teach themselves one hook and then record it on repeat throughout. Overall, I'd say when it comes to the audio, there are some occasional standouts, but it's pretty mediocre throughout. And that brings us to gameplay and a bit about the story. You play as Travis Touchdown, harbinger of death in the prior games, but here, years after the events of the last game, you find yourself living out a somewhat solitary life in a beat-up trailer in the woods. And then suddenly, you're attacked by Badman. An odd cutscene or two later, you and Badman are joining forces to battle through a number of games you find for a video game console that slowly drives users insane. If you complete all the games, one wish will come true, so both of them jump straight on in, and you're off. 1 second hunt down murderers in a top-down Burbs reenactment, another time launching off into a motorbike racing sim with you actually having to learn how to shift gears and upgrading your motorbike by cleaning the local skyscraper. And by cleaning, of course, I mean running through it and smashing the shit out of enemies like you expect old rolls of juicy fruit to be inside. This is when Travis Strikes Again is at its best, when you're just going headlong into enemies, the world cut off into sections by digital barriers, and you're unleashing holy hell on enemies that have picked the very worst person to attack. And it's hard not to argue that at those times, Suda51 isn't some kind of CRISPR genetically modified baby made in some artificial womb somewhere that mixes David Lynch and Robert Rodriguez almost perfectly. And the oddity of his presentation, as well as the oddity of the gameplay story, really does work out, going from sedate RPG storytelling device to Tron Motorcycle Run, really lickety-split. Now, when it comes to games like this, control is going to matter, and luckily, aside from one particular issue, overall control is actually spot on. Attacks landed where they were supposed to, as well as Travis and Badman feeling incredibly reactive to what I wanted to do. While I only got to play about 2 of the levels in multiplayer, overall that worked fine as well. Now, as you battle across the various areas, you collect XP as well as chips, coins, and cash. XP raises your character's levels, coins and cash both unlock shirts, all of them from other indie developers, which I think is a really cool shout out to everybody involved. Now, chips are the more interesting element here, and probably because each one of them is named after a Gundam bot. They offer special moves to the characters that you can assign to the buttons that each have their own countdown timer to use again. Laser bombardments, fat mannequins that confuse enemies, and possibly the best one, which is a massive damage wall that enemies cannot get past and have to destroy. It's nice to see this kind of thing as a special move on a character, because in many games that's actually a sub-boss or main boss's special skill. Speaking of bosses, Suda's time spent working on Fire Pro Wrestling as his first major title he worked on sees reflections played throughout Travis Strikes Again, with the killing moves against the main bosses usually utilizing some over-the-top wrestling move like a massive suplex or body press. It's at those times that you imagine Suda just rubbing himself all over this game as it goes gold, because you see his reflections in almost everything here. He isn't like many developers that are too busy taking glamour shots of them looking loftily into the distance like they're contemplating the design decision that's going to restructure the future, then going off and riding dolphins and partying on a boat paid with microtransactions. In fact, he purposely put together a smaller team specifically for Travis, and for better or worse, that shows. One place it shows, sadly, is in the bugs. Many times when loading a level, interactions with items in the game world did not work, and I had to reload the level by leaving and coming back. This happened across many of the different levels. Also, I got a complete crash on a load, which is pretty rare for me when it comes to Switch games. It's certainly not bug-ridden by any means, but it's lacking a bit of the polish I admit I expected. Now, when it comes to length, it's about 8 to 10 hours with another 4 to unlock most of the items like the shirts or gather some cash. But the big question is, will you want to do that? And that brings us to fun factor. Everything, absolutely everything in Travis is soaked in the same sweetness that came in the soda sold in arcades back then. You know what I'm talking about, where one drink gave you diabetes and they handed out free kidney donor cards. Each arcade game was covered in germs like a candy shell around a diseased Skittle. That is the best moments of Travis. Suda tries his best to reflect those times when Tron ruled that wasteland and when every death sent you back to your parents to get quarters. I like those moments. But throughout the entire time I was playing this game, it felt just a bit obtuse and almost like it was a little confused between bringing in newcomers and getting diehard fans something that they wanted. It isn't that fun either. While it has a very basic leveling up system, that doesn't make a huge difference in the game anyway, and the skill chips are unique and fun and allow for some variability in the combat, but overall it's actually relatively shallow even on the harder difficulties. The requirement to occasionally repower up your weapon and timers for your specials are all there, but it feels like it's missing the magic. Going to special locations and sitting down for your Instagram with ramen really feels like a ripoff of a lot of other games and doesn't really do anything special. Even the midsections feel basic, like you have a very small trailer that Travis lives in. You can look around it. Travis's current digs are pretty cool. You basically just have a couple emails, you buy some new shirts, and randomly talk to a person or two. And also, I have to say, the humor is on point for sure when it comes to places about jokes about websites and writers trying to be the first one to have a scoop and bullshit articles about various game topics that work well to remind us of the bygone days of Next Generation Magazine or Die Hard Game Fan. However, after about the first third or maybe half of the game, that actually sort of leans out and stretches out, and the game's basic gameplay chops start to hold it back. Here's the thing, games like this need to have one underlying thread that ties it all together, and through the first maybe third or half of the game, it felt like it was the humor doing that. Sure, it was rough, but it had some charm. But again, the story seems to fall off a little bit. It feels like there's a drive for this title to capture the biggest audience by throwing a ton of stuff out there, and they wrapped it into this tremendous idea, but it needed more time to cook almost, and a bit more time to develop. As you guys know, I rate games on a buy, wait for sale, rent, or never touch it again rating scale. I would say this, the price certainly does help it. If you're an absolute diehard fan, you may be able to get through this on just the weirdness alone, but even then, it feels to me like you'd be hard-pressed to say this is anything better than a deep, deep sale. There just isn't that much here, and even when the game has you diving into its locations, it's not backed up with the gameplay chops or even the waggle that the original had, and instead seems like the levels and adjusting locations are used almost like a band-aid for the lack of truly fanciful ideas. Suda made it clear that this title wasn't going to have as much of the attitude as the prior titles, and you can see that reflected with almost no titillating moments in the cutscenes like those prior games, and with only the occasional cuss word and the special move moments, this actually reduces the package a bit. It's sort of like taking out the oddness in a David Lynch movie. For me at least, the Switch really is starting to nail its third-party content, and that means more competition. And when something this rough arrives and doesn't really have the same charm or otherworldliness as the other games, it's hard to suggest people check it out. Maybe it's that you're leaping into video game worlds, but somewhere along the lines, I sort of wish that Travis had chosen a game world to exist in and stuck with it just a little bit longer to strengthen and bring up those gameplay chops. My sincere hope is that diehard fans like it more than I did, as I love the quirky stuff, and Suda's always pushed the envelope, and I've enjoyed the titles that he's made, but here in many places, the envelope just says, return to sender. So I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Maybe check me out on Twitter, Reddit, or Twitch. ACG on Twitch is my location there. And of course, you can become a patron on the Patreon website, where we have the absolute best gameplay discussion group that I think I've ever seen, as well as a bunch of different people playing games together. But regardless of all that, welcome to 2019. Peace out and enjoy the rest of your year.